The Walton family, heirs to the Walmart fortune, has used a structure called Walton Enterprises LLC, paired with a strategy of rolling sequential trusts to move more than $9 billion across generations while minimizing estate tax exposure. That's a legal and financial achievement, but underneath the legal paperwork sits something far less discussed and arguably just as important: a recurring, disciplined calendar of actual meetings, specific rooms, specific people, specific agendas, repeated on a fixed schedule for decades, without which no trust document would ever function as intended. We've covered the legal tools of generational wealth extensively on this channel: trusts, tax strategy, incentive structures. Today we're covering something almost nobody explains clearly: the actual, specific meetings that wealthy families hold on a specific rhythm, and precisely what happens inside each one. If you want the real operational architecture behind generational wealth, not just the trusts, the actual calendar, subscribe now. This channel breaks it all down every week. 1. The family assembly, the one meeting everyone attends. The largest, broadest, and least frequent meeting in a wealthy family's governance calendar is called the family assembly, and understanding its specific purpose is essential because it's the meeting most people mistakenly assume is where all the real decisions get made. It usually isn't. According to family governance frameworks developed by researchers like John Davis at Harvard Business School, a family assembly typically meets once a year, usually lasting 1 to 2 days, and includes every eligible adult family member, a category that, in most well-run families, deliberately includes spouses and in-laws, not just blood relatives. Families differ on exactly when younger members join. Some set the threshold once a child is old enough to attend independently, while many formal frameworks suggest bringing the rising generation into at least some portion of these meetings around age 16, with younger children often given their own parallel activities designed to start building relationships with cousins and a basic familiarity with the family's affairs. The purpose of this meeting is explicitly educational and connective, not primarily decision-making. Governance researchers describe its core functions as discussing family vacations and philanthropy on one end of the spectrum, and educating members about their rights, responsibilities, and the family's overall financial health on the other, essentially a once-a-year state of the family gathering that keeps dozens, sometimes hundreds, of family members aligned on the same basic facts and direction, regardless of how spread out or personally disconnected their individual lives have become. There's a specific structural reason this meeting is kept large and infrequent rather than small and constant. A room with dozens or hundreds of people, meeting only once a year, simply isn't well suited to making detailed operational decisions. Imagine trying to agree on next quarter's investment allocation with 80 relatives in the room, several of whom haven't seen each other since the previous year's assembly. What a large annual gathering is well suited for is exactly what smaller, more frequent meetings can't replicate. Building the shared identity, trust, and basic financial literacy that every other governance structure in this video ultimately depends on. Families that skip this meeting entirely, assuming that legal documents alone will keep everyone aligned, are often the ones who discover, a generation later, that half the family barely recognizes the other half, a condition that makes every other governance mechanism dramatically harder to operate. 2. The family council, where the actual work happens. If the family assembly is the annual town hall, the family council is the standing committee that actually runs the town in between. And it's the meeting doing most of the real governance work across the entire year. According to guidance from RSM's Family Office Advisory Practice, a family council is typically nominated by the broader family assembly, with 5 to 9 members drawn deliberately from across different generations, family branches, and roles within the family enterprise. Some working inside the business, others not, to keep the group genuinely representative rather than dominated by whichever branch happens to be most operationally involved. Unlike the assembly, the council meets far more frequently. Family enterprise researchers consistently recommend quarterly meetings at minimum, functioning in the words of one governance framework, similarly to a board with a chair and vice chair to facilitate meetings and report back to the family assembly. The council's job list is specific and substantial. Governance researchers identify its core responsibilities as drafting and maintaining the family constitution, discussed in an earlier video on this channel, developing family employment policies, coordinating education programs for the rising generation, and, critically, serving as the bridge between the wider family and the business, the family office, and any other governance bodies the family maintains. One governance consultancy describes the council succinctly as functioning like the executive committee of the family, with meetings that are operational rather than ceremonial, focused on specific decisions and the preparation of agendas for the much larger annual assembly. There's a specific governance failure this structure is designed to prevent, and it's worth naming directly. Without a council, every family decision either falls entirely on whichever individual happens to hold the most authority, usually the current patriarch or matriarch, or gets debated informally, inconsistently, and often unfairly among whichever relatives happen to be in the room at the time. A properly functioning council replaces both of those failure modes with something considerably more durable. A defined, rotating body with fixed terms, clear representation across the family's different branches, and a specific recurring meeting schedule that continues functioning even after any single individual family member, however influential, is no longer alive to run things personally. This is exactly the kind of operational, mechanism-first breakdown this channel exists for. If this structure is clarifying things for you, drop a comment with the word council. It tells me you want more deep dives into how real family governance actually works. 3. The board meeting, where the family meets the business. The third meeting in this taxonomy is one that, unlike the previous two, isn't exclusively a family meeting at all. The board of directors meeting for the family's operating business, if one exists. Governance advisors at BBH describe a well-structured family business board as including a specific mix of participants: family council members, senior management, and, critically, genuinely independent, non-family directors, brought in specifically to bring outside expertise and a measure of objectivity that pure family membership can't provide on its own. These meetings typically occur on a quarterly basis, and their sole stated purpose, according to family enterprise governance frameworks, is to oversee management, protect and grow shareholder value, and provide stability and continuity, particularly during periods of family conflict or leadership transition. The specific function independent directors serve here is worth understanding in detail, because it connects directly to the neutral party principle covered in an earlier video on this channel about how old money families avoid feuds. BBH's governance advisors describe a well-composed board as functioning like a shock absorber between the competing interests inevitably present in any family business: majority versus minority owners, executives versus outside stakeholders, and the senior generation versus the rising one. Acting as, in their words, an honest broker between competing visions, providing a disciplined forum for genuine debate, rather than a room where the loudest or most senior family voice automatically wins every argument. This board meeting is deliberately kept structurally separate from the family council meeting covered in the previous section, even though some individuals may sit on both. The reasoning is straightforward. A family council exists to represent the family's interests and values as a family. A board of directors exists to represent the interests of the business and its shareholders as an enterprise, which, especially in a large multi-generational family, is genuinely not always the identical thing. Conflating the two meetings, governance researchers consistently warn, tends to produce a forum too large and too politically complicated to make good business decisions, while simultaneously failing to give the family itself a dedicated space to discuss purely family matters without the added pressure of formal corporate fiduciary duties in the room. 4. The Investment Committee, the meeting that never gets exciting on purpose. A fourth, more specialized recurring meeting exists specifically for families with significant investable assets and a dedicated family office. The Investment Committee. We've covered the actual investment philosophy behind old money's portfolio construction in detail in an earlier video on this channel. The diversification, the illiquidity premium, the resistance to leverage. This meeting is where that philosophy actually gets applied, monitored, and adjusted over time. According to family enterprise governance frameworks, specialized committees like the Investment Committee, along with parallel bodies for philanthropy and next-generation education, meet on their own independent schedules, typically monthly or bi-monthly, and report their work upward into the broader family council structure, rather than operating as a fully independent body accountable to no one else in the family. The composition of this meeting differs meaningfully from the family council itself. Rather than being chosen for representative balance across family branches and generations, investment committee participants are typically selected specifically for financial expertise. Some family members with genuine investment backgrounds, supplemented heavily by outside professional advisors. The family office's chief investment officer, outside asset managers, and sometimes independent investment consultants brought in specifically to challenge the committee's assumptions and prevent the kind of insular, overconfident decision-making that can develop when the same small group reviews the same portfolio together for decades. The deliberate, almost anticlimactic tone of these meetings connects directly to the psychological discipline covered in our earlier video on why old money values boredom. A well-run investment committee meeting, by design, should rarely feature dramatic pivots or urgent, headline-driven decisions. The entire structure exists specifically to slow down and formalize what could otherwise become an emotional, reactive process, replacing any single family member's individual impulse to chase a hot opportunity or panic during a downturn, with a standing, recurring, unglamorous review process that simply keeps happening, on schedule, regardless of what the news cycle is currently excited about. If the idea of a deliberately unexciting investment meeting sounds like exactly the discipline this channel keeps highlighting, that's exactly why it's here. Subscribe so the rest of this series doesn't get lost in your feed. 5. The Next Generation. Meeting training the future committee members. A fifth recurring meeting exists specifically to solve a problem every governance structure in this video eventually runs into. None of these meetings function well if the people inheriting them were never taught how to actually participate. We've covered, in an earlier video on this channel, the informal childhood curriculum wealthy families use to prepare heirs. The ledgers, the chores, the exposure to family philanthropy decisions from a young age. The Next Generation Education Committee, or Rising Generation Program, is the formalized adult-facing version of that same instinct. A recurring meeting, typically organized separately from the main family council, specifically designed to prepare younger adult family members for eventual participation in the family's actual governance bodies. Family enterprise governance frameworks describe this committee's work as covering both technical and relational ground, teaching younger family members how to read a balance sheet or evaluate an investment manager's performance on one hand, and building the cross-branch, cross-generation relationships that make the larger family assembly and council function smoothly on the other. Crucially, these sessions frequently include structured opportunities for younger members to sit in on portions of actual council or investment committee meetings as observers before ever being nominated to serve on either body directly, a kind of governed apprenticeship, not unlike the incentive trust structures covered in an earlier video, where genuine participation and authority are earned progressively rather than granted automatically the moment a family member reaches a certain age. This meeting is arguably the single most important one in this entire video for long-term family survival, precisely because it's the mechanism that keeps every other meeting in this list from eventually collapsing. A family council, an investment committee, and a board of directors are only as durable as the pipeline of prepared, capable family members ready to eventually take a seat in each of those rooms. Without a dedicated, recurring effort to build that pipeline deliberately, even the most sophisticated governance structure in the world eventually runs out of qualified people to actually staff it. 6. The philanthropy meeting, the one room where giving gets decided. A sixth recurring meeting handles a subject we've covered in detail in an earlier video on this channel. How old money treats the act of giving as something to be handled with the same quiet discipline as everything else it does. And that discipline requires its own dedicated governance forum, the Family Foundation or Philanthropy Committee meeting. This committee typically operates with its own board, its own recurring meeting schedule, and its own specific process for reviewing grant applications, setting giving priorities, and evaluating the actual impact of prior gifts. Family governance frameworks. Note this committee frequently serves double duty as a genuinely valuable training ground for the rising generation discussed in the previous section, giving younger family members real, hands-on decision-making experience, allocating actual money to actual causes, at a scale where a well-intentioned mistake carries reputational risk rather than any threat to the family's core capital, echoing the family bank concept covered in an earlier video on old money's unwritten financial rules. The meeting's format tends to blend the technical and the values-driven in a way most other governance meetings in this video don't attempt to. A portion of the agenda typically resembles ordinary due diligence, reviewing a nonprofit's finances, its track record, and its likely effectiveness, much like the investment committee evaluating a fund manager. But another portion is explicitly about family identity and values. What causes does this family actually care about? And why and how has that answer changed? or stayed consistent across generations. This is frequently the single meeting in a family's entire governance calendar, where the oldest and youngest members of the family are most likely to be found working through a decision together as genuine equals, since a grant recommendation carries none of the seniority-based authority that so often governs decisions about the business or the investment portfolio. This is the part of old money governance that rarely gets explained clearly, how giving away money gets its own dedicated recurring meeting with its own deliberate purpose beyond the gift itself. If you want the Mechanism First version of this world every week, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. 7. The Retreat and the Advisor. Review the meetings that tie everything together. Two final recurring events round out a wealthy family's governance calendar, and both serve a purpose distinct from the operational meetings covered so far. The first is the multi-year family retreat, distinct from the annual family assembly, and typically held far less often, on the order of once every 3 to 5 years, according to family governance advisory frameworks. Where the annual assembly is relatively brief and business-focused, the retreat is deliberately longer, more immersive, and considerably less structured around formal agenda items. Advisory guidance on family meeting design notes that many families deliberately combine elements of the family council meeting with a family reunion or extended vacation, specifically because, in their words, this kind of relationship-oriented interaction with the family helps strengthen the social connections that are so important for your family's success. The underlying logic being that a family that only ever meets to discuss money and governance, without ever simply enjoying each other's company, tends to accumulate exactly the kind of quiet, interpersonal friction that erodes trust well before it shows up as an actual disagreement over a specific decision. The second is the annual advisor review meeting, a recurring session usually held separately from the family's own internal governance meetings that brings together the family's attorneys, accountants, and investment advisors specifically to review whether the family's existing legal and tax structures still reflect current law. This meeting matters enormously in practice, and it connects directly to a detail covered in our earlier video on how old money legally reduces its tax burden. The 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill Act meaningfully raised the federal estate tax exemption, which means trust and estate structures built under prior law around a very different set of assumptions may no longer be optimized for the family's actual current situation. Families with a disciplined, recurring advisor review meeting catch and correct exactly this kind of drift as the law changes. Families without one frequently discover years later that they've been operating under a plan built for rules that no longer exist. Taken together, these two final meetings complete the full picture. The retreat protects the relationships that make every other governance body possible, and the advisor review protects the legal and financial architecture that every other meeting in this video is ultimately trying to manage. Neither one on its own would be sufficient. A family with flawless legal documents, but no relational trust, eventually fractures anyway, and a family with wonderful relationships, but stale, outdated legal structures, eventually loses far more to taxes and mismanagement than any amount of goodwill can offset. The actual lesson. Here's what ties every meeting in this video together. None of them, individually, guarantee that a family fortune survives. A single well-run family council meeting doesn't prevent a feud. A single well-attended annual assembly doesn't prepare an heir for real financial responsibility. What actually produces a durable multi-generational fortune is the same principle we've returned to throughout this entire channel, just applied to a calendar instead of a portfolio. A disciplined, recurring structure, repeated reliably enough for long enough that it eventually becomes as automatic and unremarkable as any other family tradition. The Walton family's $9 billion transfer wasn't accomplished by a single brilliant trust document. It was accomplished by decades of exactly the kind of recurring meetings covered in this video: councils, boards, investment reviews, advisor check-ins, each one unglamorous, each one repeated on schedule, year after year, long after the initial excitement of any single decision had faded. Old money doesn't just protect its capital through legal structures and its heirs through education. It protects the entire system, permanently through a calendar. A specific recurring set of rooms, people, and conversations that quietly keep happening long after any single family member who built them is gone. If this gave you a real practical look at how generational wealth is actually managed day to day, subscribe to Old Money Opulence, new investigations into the real mechanics behind generational wealth drop every week. And if you want to see the specific conflict prevention tools these meetings are ultimately designed to support, watch the companion video, How Old Money Families Avoid Family Feuds, breaks down exactly what happens when this governance calendar isn't built in time. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.